Imagine being part of the biggest band in the world, yet feeling invisible. George Harrison, the so-called quiet Beatle, carried a bitterness that fame couldn't wash away. Behind the peaceful smile was a man pushed aside, second-guessed, and quietly boiling. And while fans obsessed over the feud between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, few knew the truth. There was one Beatle George resented more than anyone. This isn't just another Beatles story. It's the untold side of a man who turns silence into his sharpest weapon. Stay tuned, because once you hear this, you'll never see him the same. In the early 1960s, George Harrison was just a teenage boy in Liverpool, riding a school bus when he met Paul McCartney. They exchanged records, traded chords, and bonded over their love of skiffle and early rock and roll. Paul was older, sharper, and more self-assured. George, quieter and more impressionable, gravitated toward that confidence. Soon, he was also drawn to the magnetic brilliance of John Lennon. It was Paul who brought George into John's band, the Quarrymen, in 1958. At the time, George was only 15 years old. Lennon initially dismissed him as too young, but Paul arranged a second audition. On that bus ride, George played the lead guitar line from the song Raunchy, impressing John enough to let him in. That moment opened the door to history, but from the beginning, George Harrison was walking into a world already being shaped by Lennon and McCartney. In those early years, Lennon and McCartney dominated the creative space. They were the main songwriters, the visionaries, the ones setting the tone. George absorbed everything, learning quietly in their shadow. As Beatlemania took off, the press nicknamed him the Quiet Beatle, romanticizing his introversion. But the truth was more complicated. Behind closed doors, he was beginning to feel boxed in. He had melodies in his head, songs in his heart, and spiritual ideas he wanted to explore. But inside the studio, his voice was often drowned out. His songs were sidelined. His guitar parts were second-guessed. Paul McCartney, with his perfectionist streak, often took over arrangements. Years later, George would say, "He ruined me as a guitar player, not out of malice, but from years of being subtly undermined." The Lennon-McCartney partnership wasn't just dominant, it was an empire within the band. And George Harrison wasn't just left out, he was left behind. By 1968, during the recording of the White Album, George Harrison had grown as a songwriter, his confidence and ambition sharper than ever. But the atmosphere in the studio was tense. Paul had taken on a de facto leadership role. John Lennon was increasingly distracted by his relationship with Yoko Ono, and George was reaching his breaking point. The tension became visible during the Let It Be sessions in January 1969. The rehearsals were filmed, and the cameras captured a telling exchange between George and Paul. Paul was instructing him on how to play the guitar part for Two of Us. Calm, but clearly frustrated, George responded, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if that's what you want." It was not sarcasm, it was surrender. Years of quiet suffocation distilled into one line. Engineer Glyn Johns, who was there, would later describe the atmosphere as very unpleasant. On January 10, 1969, George Harrison simply walked out. He quit the band. He did return a few days later, but under new terms. Soon after, he began crafting something, and here comes the sun. Two of his most celebrated works, proof of what he could create when left alone. Still, the damage to his relationships, especially with Paul, was permanent. When the Beatles officially broke up in 1970, the public's attention focused on the feud between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. But George Harrison was quietly severing his own ties, particularly with Paul. His 1970 solo masterpiece, All Things Must Pass, included several songs that had been rejected by the Beatles. One track, Wah Wah, was bright and energetic on the surface, but lyrically it carried a sharp bite. Many interpreted it as a direct commentary on Paul's controlling studio behavior. In 1973, he followed with Sue Me, Sue You Blues, written in response to the legal chaos after Paul McCartney initiated the lawsuit to dissolve the band's business partnership. To George, it felt like a betrayal, not just because of the legal fight, but because it made clear how far apart they had grown. His then wife, Pattie Boyd, would later recall, "They tolerated each other, but I don't think they really loved each other." By the mid-1970s, George Harrison was thriving as a solo artist, but the scars of his Beatles years lingered. In a 1975 interview, he admitted, "I had no confidence in myself as a guitar player, having spent so many years with Paul." He clarified that Paul wasn't malicious, just overpowering. Being second-guessed for so long had left him drained. He even said he'd gladly work with John Lennon again, but not with Paul McCartney. "Paul is a fine bass player," he said, "but a bit overpowering at times." For George, the struggle wasn't only about music. It was about space, the freedom to grow. And in the Beatles, that space was almost non-existent. If Paul McCartney frustrated him, John Lennon hurt him in a different way. In the early years, George looked up to John almost as an older brother and mentor. Lennon encouraged him to experiment and stretch as a songwriter. But as time went on, John became increasingly distant, absorbed in his personal life and his partnership with Yoko Ono. He mocked George's deepening interest in Indian music and spirituality, dismissing it with sarcasm. When George Harrison published his 1980 memoir, I, Me, Mine, he barely mentioned John Lennon, a silence that was anything but accidental. After Lennon's tragic murder in New York City in December 1980, George released All Those Years Ago. As a tribute, it honored their early bond, but didn't hide the fact that their closeness had faded long before that night. By the 1990s, George Harrison had stepped out from under the Beatles' shadow. He was a respected solo musician, a philanthropist, and a spiritual thinker. He rarely spoke about the band unless prompted, and when he did, his tone was often dry and ironic. Asked once if he missed being in the Beatles, he replied, "Not with the others, no." In 1994, he reunited with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr for the Beatles anthology, completing John Lennon's unfinished demos Free as a Bird and Real Love. To the world, it looked like a moment of healing, but inside the studio, the old patterns resurfaced, Paul giving direction, George rolling his eyes. Producer Jeff Lynne remembered the tension vividly. Even Paul later admitted, "We got on each other's nerves, but we got through it." In 1997, George Harrison received a diagnosis that would change the course of his life: throat cancer. Determined and private as ever, he underwent treatment and, for a time, entered remission. But the relief was short-lived. The illness returned, this time spreading to his lungs and brain. Faced with the inevitable, George withdrew from the public, choosing to spend his remaining years in the serenity of Friar Park, his grand Victorian estate in Henley-on-Thames. There, surrounded by the gardens he loved so deeply, he devoted himself to quiet moments with his wife Olivia and son Donnie. Even in his final months, George's wit and understated sharpness remained intact. In 2001, during one of his last public appearances and online chat, a fan posed a question that cut straight to the heart of his Beatles years. "Does Paul McCartney still annoy you?" George didn't answer directly. Instead, he recited a Victorian proverb, "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass." It was philosophical, kind on the surface, but it carried the weight of history and perhaps a flicker of truth that only he fully understood. As his health worsened, Paul McCartney came to see him. In that quiet meeting, the years of tension seemed to soften. They sat together, holding hands, an act unimaginable in their younger days. Paul later remembered, "He was my baby brother. We joked, we talked about silly things. It was like we were dreaming." On November 29, 2001, in Los Angeles, George Harrison passed away. Surrounded by love, his final words, spoken to Olivia, were simple yet profound: "Love one another." George left behind far more than timeless music. He left a legacy of resilience, spiritual searching, and quiet rebellion. He was not the loudest Beatle, but perhaps the most human. A man whose connections with John Lennon and Paul McCartney were built on a fragile weave of admiration, love, bitterness, and unresolved pain. Even in death, his story remains as Complex and captivating as the music he gave the world. Did he truly make peace with Paul? Perhaps partly, perhaps not at all. Some wounds, no matter how much time passes, never fully close. What do you think? Did George Harrison ever truly forgive Paul McCartney? Or did that distance remain until the very end? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this untold chapter of music history, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories from behind the spotlight. Thanks for watching.